Hello and welcome to the London part of the show. I'm Jo Coburn. Joining us for the duration, Tulip Siddique, Labour MP for Hampstead and Kilburn, whose aunt is Prime Minister of Bangladesh, and Paul Scully, Conservative MP for Sutton and Cheam, who is co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group for democracy in Burma. And I want to start by asking you both about your reflections on the humanitarian crisis in Myanmar and the plight of the Rohingya people. I understand you were there on the border very recently, Paul.
Yeah, I went with the Conservative Friends of Bangladesh for a week, but we spent 2 days in Cox's Bazar on the border and in some of the camps. We saw some really horrific things and heard some horrific things, and we were determined to come back and tell those people's stories here in Parliament.
Well, let's take a look at some of the pictures, because there are quite distressing images of a mass exodus leaving Myanmar and coming into Bangladesh. These were the streams of people that were captured on film by the BBC, and they are arriving and they are being looked after in camps in Bangladesh. And, of course, with your connections there, Tulip, your aunt, of course, in her leadership role in Bangladesh, how are they coping?
Well, you're probably aware, Jo, that Bangladesh is the 8th most populous country in the world, so it's not a very rich country. It's also a very young country. It only came into being in 1971, and it's taken in these refugees, or the Rohingya. It's very difficult, from what I can imagine and from what I hear. It doesn't have a lot of money. The country doesn't have a lot of money, and they have 500,000 people from the Rohingya community living in Bangladesh at the moment. So you can only imagine.
What about reflections by Bangladeshis here in London? Sending shockwaves, no doubt, through the capital.
That's right. And as I mentioned, Bangladesh is a very young country. It only came into being in 1971. So the War of Independence is still very much in people's minds. And that was called a genocide. And what's happening now in Myanmar has the hallmarks of a genocide, which is why people are so sympathetic.
Right. I mean, why, Paul? I mean, you are the first MP in the House of Commons of Burmese heritage. Why has Aung San Suu Kyi not spoken out about the atrocities going on in Myanmar?
Well, the fact that my father was born there, it just absolutely breaks my heart to actually see this happening. I said in Parliament last week that Aung San Suu Kyi should be speaking out more clearly, but who we need to be focusing our eye on is a guy called Min Aung Hlaing, who's the Commander-in-Chief. He's the guy that can stop this tomorrow.
But she could stop it if she spoke out. I mean, she is such an influential person, not just in her own country, but also around the world.
She's a person of influence, but she's a de facto leader. The military still have a huge influence on the government, and they also run that state, the Rakhine state as well. They're the ones that actually we need to put pressure on to stop this immediately.
Right, but I mean, she has an overwhelmingly popular mandate, and she has said no conflict has taken place since the 5th of September and no clearance operations. Well, that clearly isn't the case. We've seen the evidence.
Well, I've smelt the evidence, actually. I saw the smoke on the Burmese border. I could smell the smoke on the Burmese border. So, yeah, that's absolutely incorrect, which is why we need to get better access into Rakhine State on the Burmese side of that border.
Right. Do you think she's been very, very seriously damaged in terms of her reputation by not doing more?
Well, I think we can see how people have called her out across the world, that there is a definite reputational damage. But I think what we've got to do, as well as calling out the disproportionate response from the Burmese military, we've actually got to find a solution. And it's a really complex situation, because the Burmese people are actually behind her in this, surprisingly. But they are actually behind her as a popular movement.
Right. I mean, in terms of what should be done here, Tulip, do you think that she should be stripped of her freedom of the city honour by the City of London?
In my opinion, one woman's silence means there's ethnic cleansing of a whole country. We are sitting here watching her while she doesn't say anything. I'm one of those people who grew up watching Aung San Suu Kyi and thinking, this woman is amazing. There is nothing I can say to defend her silence. Whereas she might not directly be in power, she has enough influence to call out the rape, the abuse, the murder, the torture that's happening to all the people in Myanmar at the moment. So in my opinion, any honours that she has to be taken away. But first and foremost, she needs to speak out, because there is ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya community right now.
All right, let's leave it there. Now, it's been 4 months since the fire at Grenfell Tower, which killed an estimated 80 people and left hundreds homeless. So far, only 14 families have been rehoused. This week, there has been a row over the future of the Kensington and Chelsea Tenants Management Organisation, the body once responsible for the building. Bhavani Vardy reports.
While work began this week to screen Grenfell Tower, there was also considerable anger over plans to disband the organisation that was responsible for it at the time of the fire. Residents fear that a bid to wind up the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation, known as the TMO, would leave them without a voice over how their homes are run and hinder the search for justice.
Justice for Grenfell!
Rotten Borough out!
The TMO was stripped of its contract to manage nearly 10,000 properties on behalf of the council, but many residents still want it to be in a position to be held to account over the Grenfell disaster.
Right now, all these people are heading into the AGM of that tenant management organisation. In that meeting, they were going to be asked to relinquish their membership and voting rights to allow the council to take control and become the sole member.
Lawyers representing the bereaved had warned that if that was to happen, then it could hinder bringing corporate manslaughter charges and civil lawsuits against the TMO. So residents are claiming a victory after those present at the meeting voted to put the decision on hold. Gordon Footer proposed the postponement.
That is the first time in 20 years that we've won a battle against the TMO. So wonderful, it feels great. If we begin that process of proper, real consultation, that will begin a healing process that we desperately need in this community.
Both the TMO and the council were widely criticised in the wake of the disaster, and Joe Delaney from the Grenfell Action Group believes the handling of this situation has further undermined trust.
It's their actions in this which ensure that they certainly aren't on the road to rebuilding that trust at the moment, and that's what their big problem is.
Melvin Akins grew up near Grenfell Tower on the Lancaster West estate. He says many want to see the TMO dismantled, but at the right time.
I think it's wrong to make decisions over people's lives without consulting them about it. I think people have had enough, and unfortunately it shouldn't take the events of something as horrific as Grenfell Tower to engage people and make them realise that actually we are going to stand up and be counted.
The Labour MP for the area echoes those criticisms.
It looks like another glorious mess and utter chaos on behalf of TMO and the council together. We've had too much of that in the past few months. We need a bit of clarity, we need some honesty, and that's the only way that anybody will begin to trust them.
The deputy leader of Kensington and Chelsea Council said the aim had been to work directly with residents rather than through a third party. He gave certain guarantees if the council was to take control of the TMO.
The TMO would not be wound up, it would be kept, it would be supported to fulfil its obligations to both the police inquiry and the criminal investigation, and that's very important. We would establish an independent board of directors on the TMO who would manage that process.
During this standoff about the structure of the TMO, many survivors of the Grenfell fire are still waiting to be rehoused. Around 80 people were killed and 203 households were left homeless 4 months ago. So far, 14 of those households have been permanently rehoused. A further 59 have accepted offers.
I'd hope that trust will be seen in the context of the £235 million that's being spent at the moment in order of providing housing to the survivors of Grenfell Tower. We've now secured 193 homes and we have a promise to secure 300 by Christmas to give people a lot of choice.
The decision about the future of the TMO has been adjourned for at least 21 days, so there's still uncertainty for residents of the borough over how their homes will be managed, and some way to go before survivors get the answers they need. But for now, they are claiming a small victory in that battle.
Paul Scully, do you understand the fears that people there have that the Tenants Management Organisation and the people on it who were there at the time of the fire might escape justice?
I can understand why there's a disjoint and a mistrust. My understanding, having looked at it, and I'm not a legal expert, I wasn't at the meeting clearly, that they were going to keep the TMO there so that they can actually get some answers and get them to meet justice as well, because it's really important that anybody is found to be, whether criminally, whether corporately, whatever, done anything wrong, they must be held to account.
Right. Do you have faith now in the process, or do you agree with your Labour colleagues like Diane Abbott, who said that commissioners need to be sent in to run the council? Is that reasonable?
I think what's reasonable is to make sure that there's some justice and there's transparency and accountability, and it really depends on what the residents want. The most depressing part of that clip for me was a resident saying this is the first time in 20 years that we've had a victory with the TMO. what kind of establishment is it where you feel like your voices aren't being heard? And I don't think Grenfell is an isolated incident. I think this is common for social tenants all across the country. And my worry is that this inquiry will happen and the government will ignore the overall effects of how building regulation and social housing regulation actually isn't being enforced.
Well, is that fair as far as you're concerned? Will the government actually take on board the recommendations after this?
Yeah, absolutely.
Really? You can guarantee that?
Well, I can't guarantee it because I'm not in the government, but I've looked at Sajid Javid, I've looked at Alok Sharma, the housing minister, and what they've said as well, and they've been visibly moved by Grenfell and the results after that and talking to people. They've also started having a green paper on social housing as a whole to see what lessons we can learn about the future of social housing.
Right,
as well.
do you accept that money, hard cash, needs to go behind some of the promises that have been made? You are right, those ministers have been very moved and they have spoken very emotionally about what has happened. But in the end, the promise that was made by Theresa May in her conference speech was still a very small amount of money when you think of the number of socially rented homes that are needed.
Yeah, what, in terms of building?
Well, yes, and in terms of restoring or rejuvenating.
So in terms of fire safety and these sort of things, I've done a walkabout of the one of the 2 tower blocks so far in my area that's council owned and that's clad. And identified some things there. The minister has talked about financial flexibilities because that will depend on each individual local authorities, whether it's loans, whether it's changing the revenue account, what different solutions for different areas.
Right, but the solutions are what people are interested in. But where's the leadership from City Hall? Where's their voice? Where's Sadiq Khan?
Well, Sadiq Khan has been very vocal on this, but my point is it's not enough for ministers just to be deeply moved. We need action, not emotions. I want to see more of the families rehoused. 14 families? It's been four months since the tragedy happens. There's 50 families which are living in hostels at the moment. That's unacceptable. And what about the extra money for fire safety? Every person I speak to in my constituency is terrified in a high-rise block. We need extra money from government to reinforce that fire safety is being taken seriously.
But do you have to look at the regulations first and actually find out what really did cause and exacerbate the fire here at Grenfell before money is thrown at solutions that actually don't solve the problem?
Obviously, things need to be looked at and we need to get to the bottom of the problem. But there does seem to be a reluctance on the part of the government to commit to money, in my opinion.
It's the local authority as the owners of the buildings that have got to be the first people there to actually look at it. 2 buildings that I talked about in Sutton.
Yeah. And where will they find the money, local councils?
Well, then they can come up with the solutions. And once we've got the solutions, we know the finances and what the cost is, then we can start looking at where that fund is coming from.
Is it acceptable that only 14 households have been moved into permanent homes?
Well, I know what they've done. Everybody's had the offer of a personal housing officer to talk through their requirements, whether they want to go into a tower block, whether they want to go in a home. The vast majority have had that discussion. And actually what they're doing, some of the people haven't moved into a new home because they're actually literally talking about decorations and the kind of place that they're moving into.
Right. I mean, you want to get the right sort of property for the right families. I mean, there is a housing crisis, of course, in London. Things don't move that quickly.
There is a housing crisis in London, but we need to prioritise people who've gone through such a traumatic tragedy in Grenfell Tower. And having been a local councillor, 70% of overall council funding is dependent on government handouts. So unless the government stops cutting council budgets year after year, the council's not going to have enough money to do anything.
Is one of the problems that actually there isn't one single champion for Grenfell Fire? Of course, there are lots of different people and bodies involved. Does there need to be a Grenfell czar?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily a Grenfell czar, but as I say, I know the housing minister has taken a really hands-on approach to this. He's been down there many times, spoken to a lot of the residents. A lot of residents have come up to Whitehall, Downing Street, Parliament, etc. So there's a lot of conversations going on. But the solutions for those people, in terms of their housing, it's a long-term solution. You don't want to put them, be moving them too many times. Let's find a long-term solution, which is difficult in London for the housing shortage that you talked about.
I don't think we need a czar. I think we need to listen to the residents, because it sounds like their voices haven't been heard for years and years, either by the TMO or the council, and we need to start listening to them. The victims have lost their families. No need for a czar, in my opinion.
Thank you. The Prime Minister recently spoke about the difficulty young people had in getting onto the housing ladder, one of many ways in which young people claim they are worse off than their parents. Now it's understood the Chancellor is considering a cut in stamp duty for first-time buyers, which would be worth around £10,000 for the average Londoner buying a home for the first time. Tanjil Rashid sat down with former Minister David Willetts, who chaired the Commission on Intergenerational Inequality, and began by asking him whether cuts to stamp duty would help win back support from young Londoners.
I think a stamp duty cut for first-time buyers would be a great idea. But also, fundamentally on housing, we've just got to get more houses built.
Isn't cutting stamp duty missing the point somewhat, given that the problem in London is so often with renters?
Well, the evidence is that young people do still aspire to own their own home. So we've got to help them achieve that ambition. You know, it's not as if young people want a Marxist revolution, they just want to own their own home. Meanwhile, of course, you're quite right, they are renting, and there's more we should do to help them both with the quality of the tenancies they've got and with the costs.
How acute are these problems in the capital in particular?
Well, London is a city of paradoxes. If you just look at pay rates for younger people are rather higher in London. However, housing costs are very high indeed. And once you allow for the fact that they're having to put so much of their income aside to pay for rent, then living standards in London are no higher than, or in some measures even lower than in the rest of the country.
As a former universities minister, you had some involvement with the issue of tuition fees, which is one of the core complaints of young people today. Do you have any regrets about tuition fees?
I think the fundamentals of housing and wages are more important than the exact way in which you finance higher education. And when you look at how we do it, this so-called debt is not like a mortgage debt or an overdraft. It's basically saying you pay 9% of your earnings above a very high threshold, only if you can afford to.
After the disappointing results for the Tories in the last election in London, there's been a lot of speculation about how the Tories can win back support in London, especially from young people. Some are saying that these policies are sort of Corbyn-light policies. What do you make of that idea?
Well, I always think, looking back to my time in politics, you should do what you think is necessary to tackle the genuine concerns of voters. Whether it's the same as a proposition from a different political party, just do what you think is right. And I think there's now a very strong appetite in government to recognise that it's right that we do whatever is necessary to offer a fair deal to younger people.
David Willetts there. Well, joining us here in the studio is Abby Wilkinson, freelance journalist who writes about the intergenerational divide. Abby, do you think the Conservatives are doing enough to attract younger voters?
No, I mean, what it feels like to me is young people turned out at a higher rate than they normally do in the last election, and now they're scrabbling around and trying to, you know, pitch watered-down versions of Labour policies in a desperate attempt to win a bit of this kind of new larger constituency. I don't trust it at all.
What do you say to that?
I don't think that's fair. I think David Willetts was absolutely right that the way that you tackle this issue is to do what is right. Now there is a balance because you've only got a certain pot of money to work this out. But I think reducing stamp duty for young people is, or certainly in London, is going to be a really important factor. But only one factor in solving housing, which is at the end of the day, supply is the biggest thing.
What do you think about the stamp duty issue particularly? I mean, if we believe that young people want to buy homes, want to get onto the property ladder, will that be an incentive?
Well, I've been reading up on it, and as I understand it, what might happen is it just simply pushes the prices up, because unless you increase supply, you know, that's if people get helped out with the money there, then sellers can just charge more. And I think there's a lot they could be doing to increase supply.
I mean, is Help to Buy really the answer when actually it is the private rented sector where people need so much more help?
Well, I think, to be frank, you know, Help to Buy, stamp duty cuts and these kind of things are only a short-term fix. It is, as Abby said, actually increasing supply. In terms of rent, I'm actually leading a debate on Monday. We're talking about taking rent into account when you're actually applying for a mortgage, because rent tends to be more than an average mortgage payment.
From my perspective, what I want is a secure tenancy, so my landlord can't, say, sign for a year and then hike the rent up to a level higher than I can afford, so I have to move every year. You know, a lot of European countries have much more secure tenancies, and renting's not such a problem there.
Right, and you think that would make a big difference.
Yeah.
Do you agree with David Willetts, though, that young people don't want a Marxist revolution?
Yeah, I think that's true. I don't think young people are all voting Labour because they're all kind of radicals. Young people want, you know, a decent life, ultimately, and they think the current system's not working. That doesn't mean that, I mean, of course I agree that we're not all revolutionaries in waiting.
Right, I mean, Labour Party has made an offer and an overture to young people, and more of them did vote for your party. But was it cynically based with promises of scrapping tuition fees? Are these things actually affordable?
Our manifesto was costed, unlike other manifestos, as you're probably aware.
And it was disputed, of course, by the Institute of Fiscal Studies.
For us, the whole point was not so much about a cheap gimmick, sort of about...
an expensive gimmick instead.
Well, it was this gimmick about tax stamp duty, I think, is such a kind of giveaway in trying to attract young people. A senior source close to the government actually said in the Financial Times, the Chancellor knows that this is the last time when he can appeal to young people. So he's doing this in a desperate attempt. Actually, in our election, we talked about lots of things. It wasn't just about tuition fees, building more houses, bringing back educational maintenance allowance. That's really important to young people in my constituency. That's the thing. That's the kind of things they should be looking at before they start talking about stamp duty.
I mean, how much are you playing catch-up here with the Labour Party? Because it is interesting that all these policies from the Tory party and the mood music has changed since the election.
Look, just because you have a senior source doesn't mean it's true. Again, there's these quotes in the Financial Times, these kind of things. But look, if you're going to tackle intergenerational fairness, it's not actually about an electoral cycle, as we've heard. It's actually about long-term views. Whether you're looking at social care and health care at the elderly stage, or you're looking at student fees, you're looking at housing at the young people's aspect. All of these things need to be tackled over long-term solutions.
Right. I mean, let's look at tuition fees. How big an issue is that?
I think there's no reason that tuition fees shouldn't be paid out of general taxation, because a lot of people went to university before tuition fees were brought in, and they're earning a lot now, and they could definitely afford to help contribute. It's not, in terms of debt, it's not the debt that burdens me most. You do only pay it back over a certain threshold. Things like credit card debt that young people are taking on increasingly frequently, I think is a much more pressing issue.
And what about lowering taxes for people in their 20s and 30s?
There's nothing wrong with, from each according to his ability to pay. The problem is young people are earning less. They have a lower minimum wage. Like, taxes should be based on your ability to pay. I think that seems like very much like a gimmick to me.
Right. I mean, in the end, do you need to hurt some of your older voters or pensioners in terms of looking at the triple lock, which was discussed in the manifesto, means testing universal benefits in order to use some of that money to help younger people, certainly in the capital?
Well, look, it's not about hurting people, but I think we do need to make sure that everybody's paying a fair amount of tax.
And have you got it wrong up until now?
Well, I think these are the things that we were testing in the manifesto. I think we actually should have spent more time debating it and actually having a more rounded debate for the long-term solutions that I was talking about. But ultimately, we can't keep on going as we are, spending more money than we're actually earning as a country, and having it in some areas in unfair proportions.
Right. Abby Wilkinson, thank you very much for coming in onto the programme today. That's all we have time for. My thanks to Paul and Tulip for being guests of the day. It's back to Sarah now.